Hello and welcome to the Chapter 13 lecture over disadvantages, and this is a basic beginner introduction to exactly what disadvantages are and what is the best way to answer them within a debate round. First thing to really emphasize is disadvantages really are not a difficult concept when you get down to it. However, there is some jargon and there are some difficult terms that might just be a little unfamiliar if you have not seen them before. However, we're going to talk about exactly what the different parts of the disadvantages are, as well as what they mean and how exactly they apply themselves within a debate round. So a disadvantage in a large sense can be illustrated by a particular video that I happen to have pulled up. This is something that you may have seen on advertising for DirecTV. This is Don't Fall Into a Dinner Party.
When you pay too much for cable, you feel powerless. When you feel powerless, you want to take the power back. When you want to take the power back, you take karate. When you take karate, you want to use your karate. When you want to use your karate, you become the fist of goodness. When you become the fist of goodness, you run along rooftops. And when you run along rooftops, you fall into a dinner party. Don't fall into a dinner party. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. Call 1-800-DirecTV.
So as you can see in that commercial example, which ran in 2012, there are a lot of things that end up getting set into motion that eventually cause an impact to happen.
When your cable goes out, you get stressed. When you get stressed,
we'll have to pause that. And that's essentially what a disadvantage is. The plan that the affirmative team is presenting is going to cause something bad to happen, and the negative team is trying to point that out. They're trying to point out that something unexpected is going to be the result of them running this plan. And so the disadvantage is meant to try to outweigh whatever it is that the plan is that is being put in place. So what exactly is a disadvantage? This would be a good point to pause so that you can take down this note. A disadvantage is an argument by the negative team arguing that the affirmative plan causes something bad to happen. Affirmative teams do not run disadvantages against the negative team. Disadvantages apply exclusively or are run exclusively by the negative team and are meant to be attached to the plan, and they're trying to outweigh all of the good things that the plan would supposedly do and instead focus on the bad things that would happen as a result of doing that plan. A disadvantage is considered an off-case argument and is almost always read in the 1NC speech. Okay, and what that means by off case, remember, anything that the affirmative team will read in the 1NC, harms, inherency, plan text, solvency, advantages, all of those are on case. That means that they are part of the affirmative case. And so anything else that is introduced by the negative team is considered off case. This includes disadvantages, topicality, critiques, as well as counter plans. Okay, and we're going to focus just on disadvantages, but just keep in mind that this is an off-case argument. If you need a simple way to remember this, this means that whenever you're flowing the round, if it's an off-case argument, that's simply an argument that you have to pull out a completely new sheet of paper to flow on. So what are the parts of the disadvantage? This is something, again, where you may want to pause so that you can take down these notes. They are uniqueness, brink, link, internal link, and impact. These are all things that you are going to see as part of a disadvantage. These are all terms that you're going to want to become familiar with. The first thing that is always read is going to be uniqueness. Then there may be a piece of link evidence, possibly internal link, and then impact. The brink, however, is something that you would find within the evidence, and we're going to discuss exactly what all that entails. So we're going to go through each of these terms and discuss exactly what the definition is and how exactly do we see them in the debate round. So uniqueness, what exactly is uniqueness? Uniqueness is evidence that shows that the disadvantage will not happen in the status quo. Okay? It's evidence that shows the disadvantage will not happen in the status quo. If a disadvantage is non-unique, then it probably does not apply to the plan. So what's the point of stopping the plan from happening if the bad thing is already going to happen anyway? So an example of this might be if you have a spending disadvantage and you're saying that the plan should not be done because it's going to cost too much money and that's going to end up killing the economy. However, the federal government spends money every single day as it is. And so if we were to continue just spending money, what's wouldn't the impact have already happened? Okay, we should have already seen the economy crash because we've already had that spending happening in the past. Okay, so another example of this, if someone, like, imagine that you are in a pool and someone splashes you and you complain and say, hey, you just got me all wet, and you're already in a pool. You're already wet. I mean, that's something that is non-unique. And so that would be an example of a situation where that would apply. So brink. Brink is the threshold that must be passed in order to trigger the disadvantage. And so that is the question where you ask how much money exactly would have to be spent in order to crash the economy. And so it's an argument where you're trying to specify, okay, if this plan is bad, if this plan causes a bad thing to happen, exactly how much of that bad thing is needed to happen in order to cause the end result, in order to cause the impact. The next portion is a link, and the link is what the plan does that causes the disadvantage to happen. Okay, so an example of a plan that would maybe fall into a spending disadvantage would be a plan where you're having to build icebreakers. You would have to argue that the plan is going to cost the money. And so if a plan needs to spend money in order to cause the bad things to happen, then that's going to be what your link is. The internal link is something that leads to another undesirable thing to happen. So this is where you've started the domino effect, okay? If a plan spends money, that's going to cause something else bad to happen. So you could argue that spending money causes interest rates to skyrocket, and that kills the economy. So you actually have a couple of dominoes that are falling right here. We've done one thing that is supposedly bad, and that is in turn causing other bad things to happen. And then finally, you eventually arrive at the impact, and the impact is the overall bad thing that you are trying to argue outweighs whatever it is the affirmative plan is trying to do. So the impact is the bad thing that we want to avoid, and usually it is worse than the harms the AF is trying to solve. And so an example of this is that if you're to argue that economic collapse leads to the loss of millions of jobs and nuclear war or some other crazy thing, you're trying to argue that this impact is worse than any of the bad things that are already happening in the status quo. And obviously, if we were to have extinction of the human race, that's probably worse than anything that we're seeing right now. So the affirmative team, the negative team, always keep in mind, they're trying to argue that things that are happening right now are really not that bad, and that if we change things up, that's going to just make things much worse. So finally, what is the goal of the disadvantage? A disadvantage by itself can sometimes win a debate round. However, keep in mind that you're trying to prove two things. You're trying to prove that, one, the plan is likely not going to work, and two, it's going to cause something worse to happen than what we already have in the status quo. Okay, so if you can prove those two things are going on, you're going to stand in an incredibly good chance of winning that debate round. You need the disadvantage, and you need to argue that the plan likely is not going to work either. Okay, so you need to do those two things within the debate round. You need to argue on case, argue against their harms, argue against their inherency and their solvency, and then also try to apply this disadvantage to it as well. Okay, so that's going to put the judge in a mindset that, okay, there's no point in risking something and trying to do a plan that likely isn't going to work when there's also the risk of this disadvantage happening as well. So just to recap, we're going to go real quickly back through everything. There are different parts to a disadvantage, and they include uniqueness, brink, link, internal link, as well as the impact. The uniqueness is evidence that says that the disadvantage is not happening right now in the status quo, and it's only going to happen if the plan is put into place. The brink is exactly how much of the plan is going to need to be put into play in order to trigger the disadvantage. The link is evidence saying specifically what is it that the plan is doing that is causing the bad things to happen in the disadvantage. The link in turn causes the internal link to happen, which leads to another bad consequence, which finally arrives at the impact, which can sometimes be considered a terminal impact, especially if you are ending all life on the earth as a result of that impact. But keep in mind, oftentimes the impact is just people are going to lose jobs, there's going to be more poverty, something along those lines would be what you would have for the impact. Okay, so go back through these terms, make certain that you are familiar with them, and the best way to understand and to fully grasp exactly what these terms mean is to continually practice with them. Practice running disadvantages, practice running disadvantages with different link evidence or internal link evidence and even different impacts. Practice running different kinds of disadvantages so that you're familiar with them before you go into a debate round.